Did you know that South Africa's oldest existing block of Sauvignon Blanc vines was planted in the Swartland in 1965? Now, of course, there was plenty of Sauvignon Blanc planted before then, mostly between the 1900s after phylloxera through to the mid-1930s. But legend has it, from the 1940s onwards, almost all of that was pulled up, mostly because the plant material was incredibly diseased. To the point that by the 1980s, Sauvignon Blanc made up only 0.2 of the entire South African national vineyard. But something began to change. Now, whether it was Robert Mondavi's Fumé Blanc fiasco in California in the 80s, or perhaps it was the stratospheric rise of Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough in New Zealand, but whatever it was, something gave South African farmers enough courage to give Sauvignon Blanc another try. The very first bottle of 100% Sauvignon Blanc to be bottled happened a little before the 1980s. It was in 1977 by an estate called Verdun, which is now called Asara. But over the next 46 years or so, Sauvignon Blanc grew from a tiny little 0.2% to the point where it is South Africa's most exported wine category, and it is also South Africa's most domestically consumed wine category, and it makes up 20% of all the white wine vines in the entire national vineyard. And by the way, that percentage is only going to climb because in 2022, it was also planted more than any other cultivar. But despite its dramatic comeback, very few estates in South Africa have really bothered to take Sauvignon Blanc seriously. And this is why today's hand drink solo wine of the day, the Klein Constantia Estate Sauvignon Blanc 2022, is such an important wine to talk about. Because Klein Constantia is one estate that has literally bet the farm on the success of South African Sauvignon Blanc. Klein Constantia is one of the coolest estates in the Constantia Valley, with an average temperature of about 17 degrees Celsius, and most of its slopes, which are up against the foothills of Table Mountain and the Constantia Berg, face south or southeast. Obviously, in the southern hemisphere, these are again cooler sites. And with all these sites, they produce not one, but 5 Sauvignon Blancs, including one uber premium single vineyard Père de Bloca Sauvignon Blanc, made with fruit from blocks that were planted in the foothills of the mountains at about 200 meters above sea level, and these vineyards had a very steep incline and could only be worked by horses, hence the name Père de Bloca, which means horse blocks. The fruit for the Klein Constantia Estate Sauvignon Blanc is taken from over 40 separate blocks of vineyards, and these are planted at altitudes from 70 meters above sea level all the way up to 340 meters above sea level. Now, at harvest time, the delectable level of nerdiness displayed by Matt Day and his team is absolutely unparalleled, because they harvest every single block at exact same ripeness level. But remember, they have a wider range of soils and they have a wide array of altitudes. And so harvesting of Sauvignon Blanc alone can take up to 6 weeks, because each one of these blocks is going to ripen at a slightly different rate. And these variations are further compounded by the fact that the really high blocks, up at around 300 meters above sea level, have this unfettered access to the really cold Atlantic Ocean, further slowing down whatever was already happening slowly up there. By now, it should not shock you to learn that the nerdiness does not end with the viticulture, because when it comes to fermentation, there is a whole new level of complexity. Remember those 40 plus separate blocks of Sauvignon Blanc? Well, every single one of those gets fermented separately, obviously because they are harvested at very different times. And just as you're about to say, well, that sounds like a hell of a lot of unnecessary extra work, well, there's more. But to get to that more, I need to give you a little bit of background info. Saccharomyces Cerevisae is by far the most common winemaking yeast in the world. It's used to make bread and beer, but in the wine world, it is top dog. And for a number of reasons, it feels as if it was almost born to make wine. Number one, it lives on the skins of grapes. Number two, it's incredibly resistant to alcohol. It can survive up to 16% alcohol environments. And number three, it produces these incredibly delectable aromas that humans seem to love, and it makes wine a hell of a lot more exciting than grape juice. This is why Saccharomyces Cerevisae really does dominate the conversation when it comes to yeasts in winemaking. The only time you might discuss a non-Saccharomyces strain of yeast is when you've been dabbling with native ferment. And native fermenters, of course, when you have a whole bunch of yeasts that are in the air and also on grape skins, and they end up all fermenting your grapes together. Now, in that mixed bag, some of them might be lovelies and produce aromas and tastes that are yum. Others might be uglies and will produce off flavors or turn your wine to vinegar. But regardless of what happens, by the end of fermentation, those other yeast strains will have died off because the alcohol will slowly climb, and as it does so, they can't survive. But guess who does survive? Saccharomyces Cerevisae. And so at the end, this dominant old faithful cultivar is usually what finishes your fermentation and produces a dry wine. And because it's so stable and dependable, almost all of the wine science and study has been around optimizing and adjusting this Saccharomyces strain to do things a little bit better. But more inquiring minds in the wine science world began watching some of these non-Saccharomyces strains, and they realized that there were some things that they could do that Saccharomyces just couldn't, no matter how much you optimized it. As a result, they realized that there was an entire world of yeast magic that had been right under their nose, but which had never been fully explored or utilized. So now there is an entire field of emerging products made with non-Saccharomyces yeasts, which can do things like reduce alcohol in fermentations by up to 2%. So you can ferment really ripe grapes. Instead of having a hot, stinky 15% wine, you can have a slightly more elegant 13% wine. Or you can take grapes like Nebbiolo or Grenache that have color compounds that are unstable and use particular non-Saccharomyces yeast strains to ferment in a way that renders those colors more stable. And the list goes on. Literally an entire world of study that is now being opened up and unleashed on the wine industry. But for Klein Constantia and Matt Day, they have been working specifically with one particular strain called Metschnikowia Pulcherrima. And there's been a whole bunch of study done on this strain and a bunch of others. And what's so amazing about Metschnikowia Pulcherrima is that it can essentially act as sulfites. So not only can it protect your wine against oxidation, but it can also protect against unwanted microbial spoilage. So you can have a wine that goes to market, which is stable and feels like it's been preserved by sulfites, but actually there has been no additional sulfur added. Now, when it comes to talking about how these yeast strains do that, that is a topic for another video because we've talked enough and it's time to drink. When we give this guy a sniff, well, I mean, this is what I love about Constantia Sauvignon Blanc in particular, because we know Sauvignon Blanc is supremely distinctive, right? Very expressive, extroverted. It's like the Jim Carrey of wine cultivars. You know, and you get these crazy, wild pineapple and passion fruit and ballerina armpit. But sometimes less is more. Sometimes what you need is Meryl Streep. And don't get me wrong, we love Jim, right? Jim is, like Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, super distinctive, super expressive. But if you're going to get into something for the long haul, you're going to go Meryl Streep every time. And that is where Constantia Sauvignon Blanc fits in. Because instead of getting the Carrey-esque pineapple and passion fruit and ballerina armpit, instead we get lime zest and elderflower, maybe a little bit of wild heather, some lemon curd, and then even a touch of kind of lemon cheesecake crust, a result of some of the lees contact in the winemaking. And on that note, I would decant this wine 100% of the time because it can start out a little tight sometimes, but given time, it opens up gloriously. Now, when we give this guy a sip, well, it's undeniably dry, beautifully textured, and very serious, especially when you serve it very cold. So again, I would let it warm up a degree or two in the glass, and you see how it begins to unfold. That pleasant, full palate reveals notes of oranges, which in turn segue into a kind of slightly bitter quince fruit. There's also touches of homemade lemonade and possibly some slightly unripe queen pineapple. And then those sweetish elements segue into a lovely textured bitter snap tail, which combines kind of grapefruit, Meyer lemon pith, and even a little bit of that bitter Seville orange, which comes back for an encore. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos every single month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising dynamic wine stars that are coming out of the unique South African winelands.